Welcome to How Brands Are Built, where branding professionals get into the details of what they do and how they do it. I'm your host, Rob Meyerson. Thanks for listening. Today's episode is brought to you by SquadHelp, the world's #1 naming platform. My guest today is Fabian Geyrhalter. Fabian is principal and founder of FINIEN, a Los Angeles-based branding agency. Fabian's also a prolific writer. You can find articles he's authored in Forbes, Inc., The Washington Post, Entrepreneur, and Mashable. And he's written 2 books, which we'll talk about today, How to Launch a Brand, and his latest, Bigger Than This, How to Turn Any Venture into an Admired Brand. Fabian and I talked about his books, his agency, and the approach he uses with some clients to build out an entire brand platform from scratch in one very long day. Here's the conversation with Fabian Geyrhalter. Fabian Geyrhalter, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, my pleasure. Good to be here.
So I know that your training was as a designer. You're sort of classically trained, from what I understand, as a graphic designer and an identity designer. Do you think your background as a designer gives you a unique perspective on how to do brand strategy?
I believe so, because I can envision strategies turn into reality, right? I can do that much easier. So it kind of enables me to see them come to life better. So as we work on strategies, I'm kind of a couple steps ahead because I already see it rolling out visually and verbally, and kind of like see that full experience come to life.
Right.
So I do believe so.
And how do you carry that point of view into what you do at FINIEN? I'd love to just hear a little bit about your firm. I'm also curious, what kind of work are you doing and what kinds of clients are you working with?
Yeah, so the way that I put it is I say we create strategic, verbal, and visual brand clarity. So brand clarity is kind of what it's all about for me. Yes, it's identity. Yes, there's, it's verbal, visual, there's a lot to it. But in the end, it's all about, we want to make sure that a client sees his or her firm in better focus, right? Mm-hmm. So what we do is we create brand strategy, we create names for companies or products, and then it kind of pivots into like that all-encompassing brand identity. The type of companies that we work with, I talk a lot about startups and I actually work with fewer and fewer of them. So usually like our businesses are pretty much like medium-sized companies to large corporations. So they're like annual revenue of like 1.5 to 100 million. And those companies, what they have in common is they all have a big opportunity in front of them. So usually it's a big relaunch, or it's a launch of a new brand under their brand, or they're spinning off into a completely new field. So they suddenly go from B2B to B2C or vice versa.
Right.
And all of them know that they need a brand that is big enough to fit their aspirations and their goals.
I want to talk about process a lot on this show. So I guess I'll start by asking, since you just said that, do you find that you have to use a very different process or approach depending on whether you are working with a startup or one of those more mid-sized companies, or is it a pretty universal approach?
I don't know if it's right or wrong, but based on my experience, it has been a positive experience. I use the same process, and I actually see my corporate clients. So if I work with like a Fortune 100 in that startup kind of manner, in a very swift but educated manner, they actually really, really love that, because in the end, everyone wants to go speed to market, right? Everyone needs to get it done quickly, but they want to make sure that all the right boxes have been checked along the way.
So let's talk about that approach that you take. I want to talk about your first book, because you've sort of documented that approach, I think, in How to Launch a Brand. That you broke that into 4 parts: brand platform, naming, identity design, and then the 4th, brand atmosphere touchpoints. Why don't we start with the first part? I heard you say on another interview that you approach the brand platform phase a bit different than most firms. Can you just talk a little bit about how you do that?
Yeah, so I ran a design and brand agency for a fair amount of time, and I hated that entire idea of all these processes and upselling clients to do really long projects and lots of spreadsheets and like lots of meetings, and it drove me crazy. And with this new consultancy, I figured, if I work with startups and they're founders, they're entrepreneurs, they think very much like me, they want to get to the heart of their brand very quickly, and they don't have the time. Usually, literally, they don't have the time, right? They need to launch in, a couple of weeks from now, and doing a couple of week exercise to talk about, brand purpose and brand philosophy and positioning is not going to happen with them. So for me, it's not so much about the type of exercises I do with my clients, but it's more about the process of how I do it. And the process is a one-day intensive. And I like to call it intensive instead of workshop because it just feels so intensive. It is.
Yeah.
It's like, it's literally...
It foreshadows to your client what they're in for, I guess.
It really does. It's like, if that doesn't scare them away, please come in. So it's literally me flying, solo myself to a client, and the furthest it took me was Croatia from LA. So
wow.
It's pretty far distances, and sitting with them for an entire day. And sometimes that's 6 hours, and sometimes it's all the way to like 10 hours. And that comes from someone who doesn't like meetings. But I love these intensives because if you have the actual decision makers in the room, and I'm not talking about the marketing guy or gal or the CMO, I'm talking about literally founder, co-founder,
right.
and then any VP in the company. If those 6-7 people sit in the room and together with them, you derive their brand to be, or you rethink their brand, it just makes so much sense because they own it, right? Like they actually feel like they're reshaping their company. And I am just the guide. I am the guide to create that clarity for them. And to me, it really turned out to be the only way that I do brand strategy. So literally, my brand strategy never goes past one day.
Wow. That's quite different, as I'm sure you know, from from what I've experienced, having come from firms like Interbrand and Siegel and Gale. So I'm just curious, do you see any strengths and weaknesses between the two approaches? Or obviously you feel yours is better, or at least better for you. I got to say, like, if I was hired as one of your employees, I think I'd be having palpitations about not having the research before we go into that room and not having, weeks to do competitive analysis and things like that. So talk me off the ledge here. What?
Who says I want to hire people?
Well, no, I'm not pitching you for.
I know, no, but the the interesting thing is, I worked with companies like Future Brand, et cetera, right? And I have seen all the processes, and to a certain extent, we used some of them, ourselves, because in the industry, everyone is kind of like using a little bit of the same ingredients to create their own stew, right?
Sure.
I just figured, if you're in a rush to create a brand, but you want to make sure it's done the right way, I can bring in enough of the expertise and background and the core exercises that other companies would do over months and months to, based on very much emotional intelligence, I would say, right? And kind of like group thinking, that we can get you there in the most safe and secure manner given the time frame, right? So I also, the more I work with new companies, the more I see them pivot after a year or two, right? So the idea of spending the amount of money and the amount of time to create your brand strategy when you know that the business might, because it's just the way that the marketplace is these days, everything is just shifting so quickly and unexpectedly. My goal is just to get you through the first 6 to 12 months, right? And then either you start really, really embodying it and you start owning it, or you start shifting a little bit. And I have clients where I've done the same strategy intensive 3 times already over the course of 7 years, because they love the process. They just shift around and they need to gain focus again.
I want to probe on the one-day workshop with just a few more questions. So I think I heard you say that you purposely walk into that room without having done too much background research or getting to know the company because you want to be sort of the clean slate. Is that true? And then do you ask your clients to do you give them sort of pre-work assignments so that they come into the room with the right frame of mind, or even just with the right information to make the decisions that need to be made in the room?
Again, so the interesting thing is that my clients are usually the founders, and they have every single data, it may be emotional, otherwise in their head. And actually, my favorite client ever that I haven't met before, right? We just had phone calls, and he signed up for an entire brand package, and it started with the workshop. And he flew in from Denver, and he literally walked into my office with bare hands. He did not have a laptop. He did not have a notepad. He did not have a suitcase. Nothing. He just walked in, and I thought that is the ultimate, sign of being an entrepreneur. It's like I don't need anything. I have it all in my head. And so it kind of shows you the type of people that I work with, and I really believe, there's some exercises I like to do them prior, right? I like them to fill out a questionnaire about, their target audience. I like to fill them out a little exercise about their 3 key competitors that they aspire to compete with realistically in the future. Mm-hmm. And it's very much brand related, right? So it talks about, a lot of what's happening in their social media channels and a lot of like how they actually talk rather than just going to their website and reading the About Us, page.
Right. Can you tell me anything about how you document the client's brand platform at the end of this workshop or the next day or whatever it is? Are there any certain frameworks you use or just what's included at FINIEN when you say this is your brand platform? What are the components of that?
I cover pretty much the core elements, right? From positioning to core values, philosophy, personality, mission, vision. But we also, then talk about the target. We talk about the competitors. In the end, it's a pretty hefty takeaway for one day's worth of work. So what I do, the way that I structured the intensive is that it's an interactive PDF. So we're getting a little tactical now, but it's an interactive PDF. So basically at the end of the day, the core exercises that we do, the really important ones, right? The positioning or the like, why does your company exist? The brand DNA, like things like that. They all are on the screen on the last slide, at the end of the day. So at that point, everyone is completely tired and exhausted and they just want to leave, and then this one slide pops up and it's already dark. And it basically says, listen, this is your brand. And it really like from the top down, goes all the way down to like just showing your brand in one word. And that is for that kind of group, that is always, it's like Christmas. It's like the holidays. It's like they look at it and they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. And so there's really not much of a follow-up after that. We create a document, which is basically already automatically spit out pretty much by the PDF. But we create a document that is really, it's just all the exercises and all the answers that we've done that day. And there's like one page in it that is like, this is your brand, and it's very much like that last slide that people look at. So, and that's just like 2 days later, and then we get started working with the client on other stuff.
Great. So I want to pivot here to part 4 of how to launch a brand. And you use the phrase brand atmosphere in the heading of that part of the book. And that's not something I hear used that often. Should I take that to be pretty much the same thing as brand experience that I hear people use, or do you distinguish between those two terms?
So first off, I love that you haven't heard it because I coined the term, so I was happy
there
to. Look, it kind of came out of that idea of far away from experience, actually. It was more about the idea of you create a brand identity and then you create collateral around it, right? And back in the days, you used to call it brand collateral, but it's really a sad way of calling something that is consumer facing. And
it sounds like brochures to me.
Oh, totally. Yeah, here's your letterhead. Don't stretch the logo. But so really, the atmosphere in my eyes was, it's the type of atmosphere that the consumer has to poke through in order to get in touch or to get familiar with your brand. So it's really everything from the Facebook ad you see to the email newsletter you get to, to a trade show you attend, to word of mouth, to like the entire, basically your visual and verbal, brand as it is out in the marketplace for a consumer to have to, witness in order to understand and start learning about your brand. That's what I see brand atmosphere being. And now, obviously, this sounds a lot like experience, but it's really more the foundational elements of brand experience. Okay. So it does not really create the experience, but it allows a brand to start building up the actual experience.
I see. And that makes sense given the title of the book. So you're just giving them the foundational elements to launch that brand, and knowing that in the future it'll become more holistic, more complete.
That's right, because experience is so much more, right? I mean, that's customer service first and foremost. That's sales. That's how are people being trained, and then the subsequent behaviors. But it's kind of like this is the toolkit, with which you can start building all of these, elements.
And so, for that toolkit, do you have any specific steps that you always take in creating that? Is there any kind of, I don't want to make it sound too tactical, but is there sort of a checklist of, we recommend that most brands start with these 6 things, or here's the list of sort of things that you could consider creating as that launching point atmosphere?
Yeah, so we kind of take a different approach with that too, and not just because I want to have everything be different for the sake of being different, but more because of the way that I work with clients. I realized that it's actually the easiest way for them to sign off and to understand how the full brand looks like. And so the way that we do that is once we have the brand identity design established, so literally the logo, right? Like there's nothing else to it yet. There's the colors and there's the logo. At that point, we tell our client to take 2 weeks, we're going to be back. And at which point we present the full brand atmosphere. And so that changes really from client to client. So usually some things are standard, right? What does a client need to launch? They need an email signature. They need a business card. They need a landing page of sorts. They need, iconography. They need patterns. They need a visual language. They need social media, right? So we actually don't set up the social media accounts, but we fake their accounts. So we say, Here would be the first 6 Instagram tiles. Here's how you use the images. Here's what type of, of quotes you would use, or here's what you would do with Instagram. And here's the text that you would actually use for it. So we write little bits of copy, but it changes completely from client to client. So I asked them before the phase, I'm like, look, you're in fashion. So I guess we're going to do hang tags and we're going to do labels. Or you're a startup, this is a new business for you, we need to create pitch decks. Or if you're e-commerce, we're going to do fun packing tapes or like cool cards, that we throw into the order, or, so it's really, that's where we get to have fun. And that's where that differentiation between brand atmosphere and brand experience, that's where we get to blend it. And that's what's really exciting. But we only show one of those big like posters of here's your brand come into life, instead of here are 3 versions of this and 3 versions of that.
I see. But it's not a complete surprise to the client because they've already signed off on what the logo looks like. So they have a sense of the colors and things that they'll see when they walk in to see that atmosphere presentation.
That's correct. So for them, it's kind of like they're so excited to see the next step, but we don't feed them, spoon feed them, one design at a time. We just show this huge, like, here's your brand come into life. And it's the most mesmerizing, thing to happen to a client with a new company. Or if they go suddenly to B2C from B2B and they suddenly start seeing, oh my God, we would have never thought about creating a packing tape like that. Or I love how you speak in social media, and we could do this. And so it's really, and for us, of course, as a small consultancy, that's where we just have fun, because there's absolutely no client input in 2 weeks, and we just kind of like any idea goes. And then it all goes back to that brand intensive, right? Like, what did we learn about the brand during that one day?
This episode of How Brands Are Built is brought to you by SquadHelp, the world's #1 naming platform. Here's how SquadHelp works. You launch a naming contest to engage hundreds of naming experts. You're guided through an agency-level naming process that goes beyond traditional crowdsourcing. The platform uses AI and includes name validation features like audience testing, trademark validation, linguistic analysis, and quality scoring. And SquadHelp doesn't just do naming. You can also use their platform for taglines or slogans, as well as logo design. To launch your naming contest today, go to squadhelp.com and start receiving custom name suggestions instantly. SquadHelp, company, brand, and business name ideas by experts. Today's episode is also brought to you by Audible. For listeners of How Brands Are Built, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/HBAB for How Brands Are Built. Again, that's audibletrial.com/HBAB to get your free audiobook. Now back to the show. Let's talk a little bit about your newest book, Bigger Than This. What motivated you to write another book, or specifically this book?
So I thought about all of these brands today that people are fascinated with, and that's you and I are the same 100%. It's all about tech, it's all about disruption, it's all about innovation, it's all about how a new product being designed in different ways, and it's all about different, but from an actual product or service point of view. And I just stumbled across a couple of companies, and I'm sure it was inspired subliminally by Tom's, right? Where Tom's, it's the same old shoe, right? There's absolutely no innovation in the shoe. And I started to see more and more of those companies emerge. And I started to realize that they are absolutely commodity type products. It's like nothing changed with those whatsoever, besides people falling in love with the brand very quickly, and it's only because of brand thinking. And so I started to realize, wait a minute, it's like if they don't innovate in any other way but through their story or through their belief or like through a cause or whatever it is, wouldn't that be super inspiring for strategists and for entrepreneurs to be able to like put those into a couple of different, chapters of like, this is how companies that are not hugely innovative are actually winning customers' hearts. And that's kind of how it came about.
And so in the book, you've identified 8 of those, what you call commodity brand traits, but 8 of those ways that companies can stand apart without any kind of huge technological innovation. I'm curious, what was the process for coming up with those 8 traits? Was it hard to get it down to 8? Did you have others that you had to kind of cross off the list? Or just tell me a little bit about getting to 8.
Yeah, I mean, so in the end, it was a tedious process of reading through all of these magazines and trying not to fall for anything that's exciting from a tech and innovation perspective. So you basically go through a magazine and there's potentially one small article about a brand where you're like, wait a minute, this product seems like every other product, but yet they're writing about it and people seem to like it. What is this about? So it started with tons and tons and tons of like case studies. And then I started to categorize them. Very much like a brand strategist would do with a lot of work, right? And I think that all of them in one way or the other are about storytelling in one shape, form or the other. But I didn't want to make a book about story because I wanted to make a book that is bigger than that so that people can literally, and I guess that was a pun, but that people can literally like just take one trait and say, you know what, we are about a strong belief, like our values are what drives people to buy the product rather than we can tell a story about anything, right? So I really wanted to narrow down to it. And I'm sure there were 12, 13, 15 at some point, but I did not want any of them to become too redundant.
Yeah, you've really teased them apart quite nicely. And I take your point that there's some similarity between all 8. They all kind of seem to blend or bleed into each other a little bit. And we'll talk about what some of them are. But in fact, maybe we should just list them out here for the listeners. So the 8, I'll just read them out here, are story. So when the background story is bigger than the product, belief, cause, heritage, transparency, solidarity, individuality. So for example, story and belief or belief and cause, to me, they kind of have some overlap, but they're also potentially unique ways of building something more powerful that sits behind the brand than the product alone.
Yeah, and I really wanted people to be able to picture it, right? A lot of entrepreneurs are, some of them are scientists or engineers, and it's not necessarily right brain, left brain, evenly, right? So I want people to see, if they see one of those traits and they say heritage, wait a minute, this is exactly what we're about. For us, right. It's all about this one city that we come from, and it's the pride, it's the pride that's regionally. And, and then obviously with Shinola, it's that perfect example where it's less about the actual background story. So it's not so much the story, but more about the celebration of origin, right? And right. Like the made in the US and the heritage. So sometimes there's a fine line, but I just want it to be something where people read a quick chapter and they're like, this is me. I think I can start infusing this into my brand.
You mentioned Shinola as one of the examples in the book, but you also have case studies throughout the book for each of these traits. Other than Shinola, are there any other favorite examples? And some of these I hadn't even heard of before, but I'd love if you could just pick one or two that you feel like they're really doing everything right.
Well, and I'm glad that you said that you haven't heard of a lot of those, because I wanted to make sure that this is not going to be the Toms and Shinola book that everyone's already going to say, yeah, I know all about that, right? I wanted to celebrate smaller brands that have a cult-like following and then study those. And because I think it's more interesting to read about new brands rather than the ones you already read about. So one of the ones that is really peculiar. It's called Fish People Seafood, and
the name is peculiar.
And the name is actually fantastic, which is even more peculiar, right? So the commodity product is fish, and I hope, and I just keep my fingers crossed that we can call fish a commodity for a mighty long time. But it's no thrills, chowders, bisques, bouillons, right? And they come in a pouch. There's no celebrity chef. There's no packaging innovation. You just basically put those pouches in steaming hot water, and then you heat it up. And then in the back of the package, that's where the genius comes in. There's a small little note saying "Trace your fish," and it allows you to use a code that you have to cumbersomely put into your phone or into your laptop. And then you meet the fisherman who put people in fish people. And that's how the name came about, right? And I have nothing to do with the company. I literally just learned about them, right? And so then suddenly, while you're eating your stew, you meet, Stefano, right? Like Stefano lifted your fish out of the boat. And then you get to see Ryan's boat, because that was the boat that actually, got your fish. And of course, more importantly, you start seeing the exact location that your fish was caught and the time in which your fish was caught. So you're sitting there eating this, otherwise, pretty, boring dinner, out of a bag, and suddenly you have this entire emotional reaction of, oh, this is actually, these people really care, and this is from a location I can pronounce and I actually know about. And then Ryan's boat is called Sunset Charge, and isn't that great? And so the more you go through that, and the more you start learning about why this product is great, but in a story form, you just get hooked. You get hooked on the brand, right? And you start realizing that this is not just soup. This is a brand, and it stands for. If you go through the entire book, right? You go through some of the chapters. Delight. It's totally delight. It's transparency. You know exactly what happened when, right? It's solidarity. It's like, yeah, I believe that food should come from the waters off of my shore rather than the head of a fish from China and the tail of a fish from Thailand, right? So I feel like there's a lot of the traits from the entire book that are kind of part of that very simple little story.
Yeah, that's great. And so some of the case studies in here, even though you've force fit them into each of the 8 traits, some of them tick off multiple traits, which is another, I think, good learning for people reading this book, is that you don't just have to choose one of these paths. It's not sort of a choose your own adventure, but that you can mix and create something really interesting by learning from each of these stories.
Absolutely. And I think some people actually mistake the book to be a guide of these are the 8 traits that it takes for you to become an admired company. And so I see some people that are struggling to put all 8 into the business. And I'm like, you don't need to do that. Just take 1 or 2, whatever works for you, right?
Yeah.
But look, I mean, all of these are very positive traits, right? I don't think that anyone can go wrong with those. But the problem is, and that's when, as an author, and not a strategist, as an author in those shoes, I'm just not part of seeing it through, right? So it's really difficult for me to see how successful they will then pull it off, because it has to be intrinsic, right? It has to be something that is empathetic to their customer, and not just here's a book and it inspired me and I want to start doing this. You actually have to really live up to it.
I have a few wrap-up questions for you here. So, funny enough, for a business book author or someone who writes about branding, that you really prefer business magazines to business books. If you had to tell somebody these are the 3 magazines you just have to subscribe to or really should read if you want to be up on the latest in business and branding, what would you point to?
So just to defend myself on the author versus like not reading a lot of business books, I own a lot of business books. I just happen to not read them from cover to cover. I usually just quickly go through them. I read the first 2 pages, the last 2 pages, and then if I feel like I missed something, I go inside to the bullet point sections, and I think I just very quickly digest it. But that's also the way that I like to write, right? Like I like to write very quick tidbits and nuggets of information, and so it's kind of like the way that my brain works. The magazines that I think every strategist should definitely read are, the big ones. I think it's Fast Company, it's Inc., it's Fortune, it's Forbes, it's Entrepreneur. It's like all the business magazines, and not even going too deep, into strategy type magazines, but really keeping it very top level to see which industry is moving where and what stories are being created and what actually sticks, and which stocks go up and why is that? What did it have to do with branding, right?
Right.
So those are the type of magazines. But look, I mean, there's also business books. I mean, someone told me after I wrote Bigger Than This, they said, you know what? It reminds me of Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller, and I'm like, I should better pick up that book. and I did, and I thought it was really enlightening. Like that idea of like, how can you actually, clarify your words and your message? And it's very much what we do. And yes, there are similarities, but that's a great book, for instance, that I would recommend actually reading from cover to cover. And obviously anything by Marty Neumeier. I mean, anything, if his name is on it, you got to get it.
The Donald Miller book is very pragmatic, I've found, as compared to Marty Neumeier, for example. They're almost opposite ends of the spectrum, where Marty Neumeier's books are inspiring and really give you a big picture point of view that he's managed to distill down almost into as few words as possible, whereas Donald Miller comes from that author background of he knows how to tell a story and how to write a story, and he's applying that to business, but he makes it very step by step, just do this, do this, do this, which is kind of refreshing also in its own way.
Right. And it would be fantastic if Marty Neumeier would write the second edition of Donald Miller's book, and it would be suddenly like 20 pages.
The best of both worlds. And
without the upsell at all times. Take my webinar.
That's right. I listened to Donald Miller's book, and you get to hear him say it in his own voice. Now go to this website and do this. And I take your point about your book as well. And bigger than this, it's funny. I suppose it's purposely a small book, a little pun also. And then it's large type. It's very kind of easy, quick read. And I like that you sort of do I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'll tell you, then I'll tell you what I told you approach, so that you really can just skim it once and get a really good sense of what it's all about. And then if you have questions or really want to apply something, you can go back and read that chapter more deeply.
I think it's important, right? And I worked with a fantastic editor at the end, and she's like, you have to bring in those action points. You have to just put out bullet points at the end of each chapter. And I think it was a really, really good move. And especially, it's funny. It's like, that's the way I work too, right? So it was the perfect way of doing it. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'll leave our listeners with this one last question here. So any advice for people either trying to get into brand strategy, or maybe they've been in it for a few years, but they're trying to grow their careers?
So if you're thinking about getting into it, it's really more defining where you think you're going to be really great at, right? Like, is it visual? Is it verbal? Is it strategic? Like, what type of branding is it? If it's strategic, I think just practice design thinking, right? Like, and test if you're actually good at emotional intelligence, because I think that in the end, that's what it really takes, right? I think that there are hundreds of great books out there about branding. And if you want to create your own, like, this is how I go through my branding process with clients, it is very easy to do that, right? It just takes time. So you don't have to necessarily be talented at deriving these strategies or these systems to derive strategies. What you really have to be good at is to connect with your clients on different levels at different times during your conversation. I think that's what the most important thing is, to really everything out of your client and then find good ways to reformat what they say in a way that would make for a good strategy, and something that then in the end you make them feel like they own it.
So is the only way to practice that to take on a client engagement and just try your hand at it?
From a selfish point of view, it would be the best thing to do. I'm not sure about the client's point of view. Yeah, I mean, it is. I think a lot of public speaking, a lot of interviews, a lot of panel discussions, and just getting yourself out there and start to work with questions or thoughts that aren't scripted, right? And start to see, how do you get past those hurdles, and do you actually have really great answers, or do you come up with something on the fly? And I think that goes back to the question of why I like reading so many magazines, because it's really about knowing a lot of just having enough knowledge to be able to have a great conversation with pretty much any client. And I think that that's a way that I would practice it, and then unleash on a client when you're ready.
All right, Fabian, we'll leave it there. Thank you again so much for joining me, and I hope we can connect again soon.
Great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to How Brands Are Built. If you liked this episode, please leave a rating and review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Fabian, his branding agency, and his books, visit FINIEN.com. That's FINIEN.com. And here's a hint. You can buy his books on Amazon, but if you want a signed copy, buy it through his website. As usual, I'll post my notes from the interview with Fabian and a full transcript at howbrandsarebuilt.com. How Brands Are Built is a production of Heirloom Agency, LLC. Our theme music is by Isha Erskine Project. I'm Rob Meyerson, and I'll talk to you next time.